Hello, hello, hello. I hope you're all having a great Saturday. Let's get started. Chapter 7 Back to School. That way, 2 blocks, take the up ramp, the tough youth said courteously, and the hard-faced young woman looked sympathetically at them. Thank you, said Derek, and Ariel, as startled as he, echoed him. The rescuers had forgotten them before they were out of sight, but Derek and Ariel remembered them all the way home. The section kitchen had become a familiar place by the time of their third meal next morning. Much of the shock of enormous rooms, enormous numbers of loud talking Arthurs, of being ignored amid mobs, was gone. After breakfast, away from the monotonous everyday of the ways, they rode south toward the edge of the sprawling megalopolis. Finally, in a section called Matisse, they found the driving school they sought. They had chosen it because it was a private school. Though regulated by the government, it counted as a luxury, and one paid for the privilege of learning here, a concept that amused the spacers. Yes, please. The receptionist was not the robot the term called to their minds, but a middle-aged woman. Though Earthers aged fast by spacer standards, she was probably quite young, perhaps no more than 45 or 50. Derek and Ariel Avery, Derek said apologetically, trying again to imitate the Earth dialect. Oh yes, new students. You're a bit early, but that's good. You have to do your forms. They thought they'd already done the forms over the communo, but took the papers and sat down. These forms were simple and asked primarily how much experience they'd had with automobiles and something called models. Can that mean what I think it does? Ariel asked. Derek could only shrug. They had sorted over the application last night, for it asked for their schooling, but our David had given them the names of schools in the city they might have gone to. They hoped the driving school would be lax in checking up. Of course, sooner or later their imposure would be detected. But even one day, they calculated. You may see Miss Winters now, said the receptionist kindly. Miss Winters kept them waiting in an outer office for a moment while she examined their forms, and Ariel nudged Derek. Did you hear that receptionist? She was trying to copy our accent. Miss Winters called them in, asked a question or two, nodded, and, taking their forms, left with a brief, "Just wait a moment." It hadn't taken her long, as they had indicated no experience. She hadn't closed the door completely. Red, those 2 students, the brother and sister, operating children slumming, or kicked out of the house, or something. Doubtfully, she added, maybe student reporters checking up on the schooling system or something. Who cares? Came a gruff-sounding male voice. They got the money, they want to learn, we sell schooling. Send 'em on out. With a dazzling smile, Miss Winters ushered them through the farther door into a large room with a number of carrels within it. Students were entering in a steady stream from a different door, and occupying carrels and other learning stations farther down. Red confronted them, a blocky fellow with thinning, sanding hair and a handsome face, his body one solid slab of muscle. He looked them over shrewdly for a moment, nodded, gave a non-committal grunt. Driving to end on schooling, he said bluntly. You either learn it with your reflexes, or else you don't learn it. It ain't so different from learning to ride the ways, that you won't remember how you did that. It was a set speech, and went on in that vein for about 3 minutes. Red's face remained blank. Derek was impressed despite his prejudices. Education among spacers, as little of it as he could remember, was a more gracious process, lavishly supported by ever-patient robots. It was clear that this indifferent man proposed to push them into the water and watch to see if they drowned. If they did not, they would only be rewarded by his good opinion. It's your money and your time, so I know you'll do your best to not waste either. Though his experience of different machines must be far greater than this Earther's, Derek wryly found that Red's good opinion was a thing worth striving for. The carrels were cockpits containing mock-ups of the control sets of various kinds of vehicles, and trimensionals of the roadways. Red gave them a brief instruction on the rules of the road and the operation of the craft, showed them a printed set of instructions on the right and of rules on the left, and said, "Do it, gatos." Derek and Ariel grinned faintly at each other, and "did it" for about half an hour. Red came by at the end of the time, sucking on the stem of a cup, if a cup had a stem, and exhaling smoke courteously away from them. He bent and looked on the back sides of the carrels. "You did good," he said, his eyebrows expressing more than his voice. "You did real good for beginners." Maybe too good, Derek thought uneasily. Red looked at them, blew smoke thoughtfully, and said, "Come down here to the models." The models were, as they had supposed, small-scale versions of various vehicles they'd have to learn to drive in order to graduate, from one-man scooters to big transport trucks. They were given models of four-person passenger cars marked "Police" and control sets, the models being, of course, remote-controlled. This was an interactive game, with a vengeance, and the other students who advanced this far grinned at them and made room. Derek started his car slowly, nearly got run over by a big truck, sped up, nearly went out of the lane going round a corner, cut too sharply, but gradually began to get the hang of it. Then a gleaming white ambulance with red crosses on its doors and top made a left turn from the outside lane, the operator crying, "Oops!" belatedly as he realized where he was. Derek avoided him skillfully and slipped past. After a moment his controls froze, as did the ambulance's. The ambulance operator grimaced, then grinned ruefully, and they all looked at a trimensional screen to one side. "A9, illegal turn, no signals, P3, failure to apprehend, traffic violator." "Frost, Swimmer Brown," Derek muttered, and the girl next to him laughed. It wasn't as easy as it looked, and he wasn't thinking only of not knowing the rules, such as that a police car is expected to act like a police car. The streets were full of vehicles, and he had to be prepared to predict their moves. None of his spacer training was of much use here. To his mortification, he rammed a fire engine at one stopping, not seeing the signal lights in time. It didn't help that Ariel slaughtered half a dozen pedestrians at a place where the motorway and pedestrian levels merged. The other students were far better, but cheerful about it, or Derek couldn't have stood it. It was humiliating. After an hour of exhilarating play, during which they got much better, Red came by and said, "Take a break, all. Give the second team a chance." The students relinquished their controls, leaving the vehicles in mid-street, and trooped out, old and young alike, to some kind of refectory. Red caught Derek's eye, nodded to Ariel. They stepped aside. "I've been watching you on the monitor record. You're not so swift on models, where I was expecting you to shine," he said. "Figured you have a lot of experience on 'em." He paused and eyed them questioningly, but they just nodded. Shrugging, Red said, "I'm gonna put you on trucks. Big ones. You ever been outside?" Chilled, Derek said, "What?" "Outside the city," Red said patiently. "Well," Derek exchanged a glance with Ariel. "Yeah, we've given it a try." "Ever had nightmares about it?" "What? No." Red nodded shrewdly. "The shrinks have all kinds of tests, but one thing talks true. Nightmares. Thing is, you're young. You could be conditioned easily if you aren't what shrinks call phobic. That means if you don't have nightmares. Big money in driving the big trucks rigs outside. Not many people do this kind of job. Most trucks are computer controlled or remote controlled. But even remote controlled ops get upset, break down, have nightmares. They even use a lot of robot drivers." "Really?" Red shrugged. "Why not? They're not taking anybody's job away. Not many people will do that kind of work. If you can do it, and will, it pays real good." Derek and Ariel looked at each other. "Don't have to decide right away," Red said shrewdly. "I know people think you're queer wanting to go outside, and I should tell you, I get a bounty on every prospect I send out." He looked at them with a hint of humor. "Oh, yeah, you got to apply for the job. Outside." He paused for an answer, and Derek said slowly, "Well, can we think it over? I mean, we don't know anything about trucks. I'll put you on simulators now. Come on, back here." At the back of the room were giant simulators they had to climb up into, 3 of them. "Most of the trucks we train on are for the inside the city, and they're pretty small. Lots of competition for the driver jobs on them. Most freight goes by the freightways, naturally, and handling the freight handler trucks is a different department of the Transportation Bureau. Lots of competition for those jobs, too. But these big babies go begging, yet they're real easy to learn." The important thing was remembering that one had a long tail behind one. They moved slowly when maneuvering, though, and anyone who had landed a spaceship could learn this readily enough. "Give it half an hour or so, and we'll look at your records." It was closer to an hour, and Derek and Ariel were both tired when Red approached them again. "You've done real good," he said, looking at a printout. "You were made for outside driving. You do much better when you don't have to watch for traffic." He looked at them with a faint smile. "It's never as frantic in the motorways as in our model. Usually they're wide open and empty. But you learn about traffic in traffic." "How'd we do?" Ariel asked, imitating his accent fairly well to Derek's ear. "Good enough to make it worth your while to go on," said Red. "A week's training and I'll be sending you out to the Mattel Trucking and Transport. Yes?" Miss Winters from the inner office had approached him. She glanced at them curiously. "You should go take a break, drink some fruit juice or something, and I'll talk to you in about 15 minutes." When they were out of sight, Ariel said, "Keep on going." "I thought so, but I couldn't be sure," Derek said. "I suppose she checked out our education or something," Ariel said glumly. "Yes, well, it had to happen, and we've had an hour's worth of training on big trucks." Derek was quite buoyant. "I doubt very much if they are equipped to chase stolen trucks across the countryside. At least, not well equipped. How many Earthers would not only steal a big truck, but take off across the country?" "We haven't stolen her truck yet," Ariel said gloomily. Derek found himself joining her in gloom as they made their way back to the expressway. And then they found it jammed and had to stand on the lower ratings level. It traveled just as fast, but it was a tiring nuisance. They stopped off at the kitchen for a light lunch, and at the personnel's on the way back to the apartment. Derek made his way back to subsection G, corridor M, subcorridor 16, apartment 21, from the personnel, with a skill that was by now automatic. Then he sat and waited, and waited. Derek was quite concerned by the time Ariel returned, and became more concerned with one look at her. She had taken twice as long as he, and looked dull. "What took you so long?" "I got lost," she said lustrelessly. "You look tired. You want to lie down?" Derek's voice kept catching with his fear. "I guess." But Ariel sat down on the couch and didn't move. She didn't respond to anything Derek said. After a long while she got up and dragged herself into the bedroom. Derek was worried and restless. He had wanted to discuss ways and means of getting a truck, but that was impossible under the circumstances. She obviously had at least a mild fever. Instead, he spent the afternoon viewing books. Some of Dr. Avery's local collections were earthly novels. Some were documentaries. Some were volumes of statistics about population densities, yeast production, and so on. It was not the most stimulating reading he'd ever done, but Derek read or viewed the documentaries. Some were print, some were audio-visual. Presently he found that it was late and he was hungry, but he hesitated. David, please check on Ariel and see if she is awake. If so, ask if she would like to accompany me to the section kitchen." The robot did so, found her awake, and repeated the answer Derek had heard. "No, Mr. Avery. Miss Avery does not feel hungry and requires no food." He hesitated about leaving her. If she felt hungry later he could accompany her to the kitchen door, but he doubted he'd be allowed in again tonight. Still, he could hang around outside and hope he wasn't questioned by a policeman. In any case, he himself was quite hungry despite his worry over Ariel. He went out, stopping off at the Personal again and getting a drink from a public fountain outside it, then threaded the maze to the section kitchen. This time he got table J10, and there was a longer wait. He saw the room was near capacity. There weren't two adjoining spaces free at the table, as the Earthers tended to spread out as much as possible. It was a gloomy meal, alone amid so many. Then he retraced his weary route. I suppose a person could get used to this, he thought. It's inconvenient, but you don't miss what you never had. The Earthers obviously didn't give it a thought. A question on the subject, R. David said. It's not necessary for all Earth people to make this trek every time, of course. Holders of higher steps in each rating have such things as larger apartments, activated wash basins, subtheatrics, and so on. Of course, it is far more efficient to supply one section kitchen for 4,000 or 5,000 households than to supply a room for cooking in each of these apartments, plus a cooker, food storage devices, food delivery, and so on. Just so with subtheatrics, when one big machine can replace smaller thousand ones. But some people do have these things, inconvenient laundry facilities and personal, without having to go to the section laundry. Don't the have-nots resent these privileges? Perhaps some do, Mr. Avery, for humans are illogical, but human emotions are allowed for in the distribution of these favors, according to the Terramin relationship. The what? The Terramin relationship. That is the mathematical expression that governs the differential between inconveniences suffered with privileges granted. D(I) sub j taken to the spare me the math. I'm not a specialist in robotics, and even my math there is not fully developed. But I'm interested. I've never heard of any kind of math being applied to human relations. Can you express this relationship verbally? Perhaps an example would suffice, master. Consider that the privilege of having 3 meals in an apartment a week, even if the recipient has to fetch the meals for himself from a section kitchen. If the privilege was granted for cause, will keep a large, if varying number of people patient with their own inconveniences, for it demonstrates that privileges are real, can be earned without too great an effort, and have been earned by people whom one knows. Interesting, said Derek, thinking that the robots of Robot City ought to know this. How do you know all this? I aided Dr. Avery in his researches on society. I also aided him in his research into robotic history. Robotic history? On Earth? But of course, Mr. Avery. The positronic brain and the positronic robot were invented on Earth. Susan Calvin was an Earthwoman, and Dr. Asion an Earthman. Those names he knew, Dr. Asion especially. The man who had codified the mathematics that expressed the 3 laws in ways that made it possible to incorporate them into positronic brains. But Earth people! Still, it might explain much about Robot City. Dr. Avery was studying mass society and non-specialized robots on Earth. Is there a book on the mathematics of human society? He asked, thinking it might well be good to take such a thing back to Robot City. Those poor robots had scarcely ever seen a human being, yet they were designed to serve for mankind. I believe there are no spacer books on the subject, Mr. Avery. However, I have several earthly references of which you might have copies. I'd like that. He'd like even more for Ariel to wake up and be her old self again. All during the afternoon he had twinges of sharp fear, and kept trying not to remember that her disease was ultimately fatal. Alright, I hope you've enjoyed the book this week, and have an excellent rest of the weekend. So, yeah, have fun. Random comment. I'd like to note that we all have a very fatal disease that's called life. Which probably would not help Derek to know, but Alright, have a good rest of the weekend.